Hi, and welcome to the Waymaker video manual. Waymaker is a sequencer that you can use to generate MIDI sequences or control my other plugins like Wall or Ridgewalk. It's my most ambitious plugin so far, and I hope that shows in the impact that it has on your music making. My goal is that Waymaker can be a collaborator and a source of inspiration, or maybe just a fun tool to use. Let's hop in. Please note that Waymaker does not provide any sound on its own. Any sound that you hear throughout these demos are from other sources. Now, what is a sequencer? A sequencer is an algorithmic way to program a melody, as opposed to playing it live or writing it out via a piano roll. Critically, sequencers have steps. You can see in this example, this sequence has 4 steps. Each time you move the sequence forward through the steps, something happens. A note may or may not occur, the pitch might change, and other aspects of the note, such as the velocity or its length, might change on each step as well. You can think of each step as a collection of musical data, which will be executed when the sequencer reaches that step. Let's see what it sounds like. You can see in this case, the pitch is reflected by these sliders. If the slider is higher, the pitch is higher. We can turn steps on and off to create a rest or a note. Another crucial aspect of a sequencer is how and when you progress through these steps. You can progress through the steps faster or slower. You could have your sequencer react to external events, such as listening to notes and progressing whenever it receives a note. There could also be some logic in how it progresses. Maybe there's only a 50% chance that it progresses, or maybe it only progresses on every 3rd event received. We can also combine and compound the output of multiple sequencers in a variety of ways. This is common in formats like Eurorack, but Waymaker makes this possible in the software realm. You can do things like summing the outputs of 2 sequencers to get a combined melody that reflects both. You could use a sequencer that outputs just a rhythm and use that to progress another sequencer in a rhythmic way. Or you can use the rhythm of one sequencer to reset another sequencer back to its start. Or maybe just one sequencer triggers another so that both of them move through their steps at the same time. We'll get to all of this later, but for now, just think about how you can combine multiple of these sequencers together. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that Waymaker is a MIDI effect. This is not a very common form of plugin, so you might not be familiar with how to load it in your DAW. Rather than inputting and outputting audio, Waymaker is going to input and output MIDI notes. In some hosts, such as Logic or AUM on iOS, there's a distinct category for MIDI effects. It recognizes that these plugins are explicitly designed not to process audio. However, in other hosts, such as Ableton or Bitwig, MIDI effects are sort of interchangeable with virtual instruments, which take MIDI as an input and output audio. So, there's kind of a weird overlap that you might need to be cognizant of in certain hosts. But I'll show you how to load it in most major DAWs. To load Waymaker in Ableton, you're going to need 2 MIDI tracks. One of them is for Waymaker, and one of them is for another plugin that you want to sequence with Waymaker, or could be a built-in sound. So, on the left, I'm going to replace this operator with an instance of Waymaker. Now, once I've got Waymaker in MIDI mode, I'm going to come over here to the second track, which is the track that I want to sequence with Waymaker. Now we need to select the MIDI from. We're going to pick our Waymaker channel. But there's a couple more steps, unfortunately. Now down here where it currently says Post FX, we're going to change that to be Waymaker. Okay? And then finally, you probably want the monitor to be set to in. So now, the output of Waymaker is sequencing the second track. Now, in Bitwig, things are a little easier, but might still be kind of confusing. So, I've created this MIDI instrument track, and I've got a sound source loaded onto it. So, to load Waymaker, you want to put Waymaker in front of this sound source. So, I'll load Waymaker. You'll now see that it's in front of that. So what that's going to do is just route any of the MIDI that is output from Waymaker into the instrument directly after it in the track. In Logic, we're going to have the easiest time so far, because Logic has a distinct category for MIDI effects here. So this is a channel that already has a software instrument loaded onto it. In order to load Waymaker, we're just going to go to MIDI effects, go to our audio units, and there it is. Now, the output, or the MIDI output of Waymaker is going to be routed directly into this instrument after it. And finally, I'll show you how to load Waymaker on AUM for iOS. So, we're going to create a new track, and it's going to be a MIDI track. I'm going to open up Waymaker, and there it is. Now, on a separate track, you're going to want to create an instrument that receives MIDI. Now, right next to that instrument is going to be this little hamburger menu. You just tap that, and then you'll see Connect MIDI Sources. Right there, you just want to select Waymaker, and you can also choose which channels to listen to. By default, it's all of them, but after that, you should be off to the races. Now, let's talk about Waymaker specifically. Waymaker offers a collection of 11 sequencers and sequencing utilities. When you first start Waymaker, you'll see that we can use it in one of two modes. In controller mode, on the left, Waymaker can connect to some of my other plugins, like Wall and Ridgewalk, to offer extended functionality for them. Most critically, you can use Waymaker to sequence and control the pitch of each plugin in a new way. Waymaker uses a unique protocol to connect to these plugins, so you don't need to load Waymaker on the same channel or track as the other plugins. As long as they're in the same project, Waymaker can find them automatically. On the right, you'll see MIDI mode. Here, we can use any number of Waymaker's collection of sequencers and utilities to build a custom chain of MIDI sequencing or MIDI effects. You can use this mode to build a completely unique sequencer, whatever you want, or you can use it to craft a MIDI effect for processing the output of another sequencer or live performance. Now, let's take a look through the UI, using Waymaker in MIDI mode to start. When you first enter MIDI mode, or controller mode, you'll see this home page. In the center, we see the current sequence that's loaded. And down right below it in the center, we'll see what type of sequencer it is. If you want to change that sequencer, just hit change, and you'll see the full list here. If you want to see the full chain that you're using as well, you can use the rearrange button. That'll bring up the full chain of sequencers, as well as let you rearrange them. If you want to add a sequencer, you can use these plus buttons on the left and right. When there are multiple sequencers loaded, they become page buttons, so you can move through your chain. But for now, let's just use one. You'll see in the bottom left, there's a scale setting. Here's where you can set what scale the output of Waymaker will be. All output for Waymaker will conform to this scale, so rest assured, all notes will sound good, hopefully. On the right, you'll see that there's a sequence reset option. This is an optional parameter that lets you change the overall length of your sequence before resetting all of the sequences automatically. This can be handy if you have a very generative or random sequence going and you kind of want to pull it back to normalcy every so often. By default, this is off though. Now, to actually configure each of Waymaker's sequencers, simply click the center display. This will bring you into the sequencer detail view, which is where we can see all of the unique controls for each of Waymaker's sequencers. This is a simple step sequencer, so you might already be familiar with its controls. We can change the pitch of each stage. We can change each stage from a note to a rest. We can change the number of stages overall, whatever you want to do. But it's important to point out that there are also a few concepts that are common between all of Waymaker's sequencers. The first is that in MIDI mode, at the top, you'll see this tab, which lets you control what mode this sequencer is running in. By default, it's generating MIDI. If we want to see all of the ways that we can change how it generates MIDI, you can just click that button. This is where we can change the octave of the root note and change the velocity and the note length. When we're generating MIDI, the sequencer typically doesn't really care what MIDI is being fed into it. There's an allow notes option for whether or not you want this sequencer to allow notes to pass through it or just take them out of the chain entirely. There's also a reset option if you want to reset the sequence whenever a note is received. We'll talk about that more when we get into how the full chains in Waymaker work. The second way that this sequencer can be used is in transpose mode. In transpose mode, as opposed to generating notes, it's going to modify any notes that are sent into this sequencer. So if we go back to this detail view, we can see that our sliders have subtly changed. Now, they're not saying that they're going to output something like C4 or D5. Instead, they're saying how much they're going to transpose the note by. So you can see here, the stage is going to add a fifth to whatever is sent into the sequencer. And this one's going to add an 11th. We can make this one subtract a fourth. By default, this is in scalar tones, but you can also change that into semitones. You can see here, now the stage is going to add 7 semitones to whatever is sent into the sequencer. And finally, we can use the sequencer in branching mode. Now, what branching mode is going to do is that whenever a note is received by this sequencer, it's going to play through one instance of this programmed melody. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit. And now, when I send a note into Waymaker, it's going to play through this entire sequence. You can control whether that original triggering note is kept or not. You can also control whether or not the sequence is going to be transposed by the incoming note. So I'll play a couple notes on the keyboard so you can hear what that transposition sounds like. You can turn that off to always play the same sequence. There's also a probability option here. You want to change the probability that this sequence triggers. There's also a hold option, which will keep the sequence running for as long as you actually hold a note. So if you want this sequence to kind of react to how long the incoming note is, you can turn hold mode on. Next, let's talk about how the sequencer progresses through its steps and when. There's two primary ways to advance Waymaker sequencers, and you can find them down here at this tab at the bottom. So, by default, a sequence is going to move when a time period passes. All this means is that when a certain time has elapsed, Waymaker is going to advance to the next step. So, now it's moving at every 8th note with respect to my DAW's BPM. But we can speed that up, slow it down. Can also use completely free timing. But by default, that's going to be synced to your BPM. Now, alternatively, you can advance Waymaker whenever a note is received. So this is going to take the MIDI input to the sequencer, and it's going to step through the sequence every time a MIDI note is received. So remember that setting to allow notes for your generative sequence. When you're stepping through a sequence based on incoming notes, you probably want to turn this off so that you don't actually hear the note that is triggering the sequence. But what this lets you do is kind of define a custom rhythm or pace that Waymaker is going to move at. If you're using a DAW like Ableton or Bitwig, you can just punch in whatever melody you want and then use the rhythm of that MIDI to step Waymaker through its sequence. So I'm just going to play some notes on the piano here. So you can see that we're stepping through the sequence every time a MIDI note is played. If we want to keep the original notes, just so you can kind of hear what's triggering it, and then finally, when you're using Waymaker to control a plugin like Weeping Wall or Ridgewalk, you'll see that there's a third option here to advance the sequence every time a loop finishes. This will ensure that Waymaker sequences are in lockstep with Weeping Wall or Ridgewalk. Now, let's see how Waymaker and Weeping Wall work together. I'm going to record one loop. Now, let's see how Weeping Wall and Waymaker work together. Right now they're connected, but not doing anything. I've recorded a couple of loops, but let's hit play in Waymaker. Now we're changing the pitch in Weeping Wall. There's a little bit of glide. We can make that more dramatic. We can even reverse certain loopers. Let's try a per loop progression. We can use this width jitter to start desynchronizing our loopers. And when using Waymaker with Ridgewalk, the controls are mostly the same. Personally, I like using them together to build up really dense, generative atmospheres. Let's try recording some of that same piano sound as before. In this case, Waymaker is randomly changing the pitch of each looper. So every time we complete a looper or a grain, we're going to pick a random pitch out of a plus 1 octave or minus 1 octave. There's an equal chance of all of those happening. We'll get into each of these sequencers in a second. But for right now, you can kind of hear what happens when you start mixing and matching these different pitches. Okay, now let's talk about each sequencer and utility that you have available to you in Waymaker. The first, the most basic option is called step. It's a step sequencer. Just like any traditional step sequencer, each step can have a variable pitch. You can change the number of steps overall. You can turn each stage on and off. You can also change the note length and velocity per stage as well. Next, let's talk about the Morph sequencer. The Morph sequencer is kind of like a step sequencer with some random control. You'll see that there's a lot more controls here. But basically, all the Morph sequencer is a random version of the traditional step sequencer. What happens is that after a certain number of times this sequence is played through, the sequence will morph. Some steps will change. You can define that down here in the bottom right corner. By default, after every one loop, one change will be made. Let's hear how that sounds by speeding up this sequence a little bit. We can make this even more obvious with a shorter sequence. You can see that after every loop, one pitch changes. You can define the range of the output here. If you'd like your random melody to be all within 1 octave, for example. We can also change how many notes are going to change in each loop. We can also slow down that rate of change. Letting your melody play through more times before changing sounds a little bit more musical. Another option available to you is locking certain stages. Say that you always want the first stage to be this pitch. And let's say we always want the second stage to be this pitch. Now they're locked, and they will never be changed by the random process. You can also directly change the pitch of these stages. And doing so will automatically lock it. Just like with step, you can also change the velocity and the note length for each stage. Next, let's talk about the weight sequencer. This is also a random sequencer, but a little different. Rather than progressing through these steps, we're going to randomly choose one on the next step of each sequence. By default, it's just a root note and an octave up, and there's a 50% chance that either will happen. Let's hear what that sounds like. It's a completely random sequence. We can add more stages here and give them a probability of happening too. This sequence is good for defining completely random melodies, but it can also be interesting when you're transposing other sequencers. So let's go back to just one root note and one octave. Put this in transpose mode. Now you see it's a root and plus octave. I'm going to put a simple sequence in front of the morph sequencer. And let's say that for now, 100% the root note. So the transposition is not really going to do anything. Let's start to add in that octave. Now you can hear that randomly, some of the notes in that previous sequence are moving up an octave. You can change the rate that this will happen. We can also do this every time a note is received, which is going to sync up the sequencers. Now, let's talk about the sum sequencer. The principle behind this sequencer is that each of these stages are going to flip on and off based on the timing that you've defined. So this first sequence, it's going to flip on and off every one step. This next one is going to flip on every 2 steps and flip off 2 steps later. And what happens when they flip on is that they're going to contribute to the output of this sequencer. So, by default, we're just outputting our root note, C4. When this first stage flips on, it's going to add 2 semitones to the root note. So then it will become D4. When this stage flips on, it's going to add 4 semitones to the output. So the output will go up 4 semitones. And when both of these 2 stages are enabled, the output's going to go up 6 semitones. So let's hear what that sounds like. You can see each stage is flipping on and off. By default, they kind of cascade. So this first stage is flipping on and off more quickly than the rest, and the last stage is flipping on and off much more slower than the rest. This lets you build up a much more generative melody, where you're kind of steering it, not totally in control, but it can lead to some really inspirational outputs. And I find this one is fun to just play around with and kind of see what you find. You can also introduce irregularity by making some of these stages a less predictable number of repeats. Next, let's talk about the Brownian sequencer. This is a sequencer built around the principle of Brownian motion, where we can randomly go up or down from the current note, but we don't jump around like some of the other random sequencers. So we started our root note, and we have a central probability which defines whether we're going to rise or fall. And when we fall, we go down by this step here. By default, it's a second. When we rise, we go up by this step. By default, that's a fifth. Let's just hear what that sounds like. Since our steps are relatively adjacent to one another, this moves in a very musical way, as opposed to jumping from one pitch to the next. You can also define a minimum pitch and a maximum pitch to define bounds for the sequencer. And what happens when you reach those bounds is defined by this button here. By default, we wrap. Let's see how that works. So in this case, we're always going up. But once we reach the maximum, it wraps back to the root note. This is the case if we're going up or if we're going down. The alternative to this behavior is called cascade. What cascade does is that once you reach the minimum or the maximum, it plays all of the notes necessary to return to the root note. So let's just see that in action. So here, once we reach the maximum, we're just going to play all descending pitches until we reach the root note again. And this is true if we're going up or down. So when we reach the minimum, we're going to play all up steps until we reach the root note again. So this can be nice because rather than jumping with the wrap option, we can kind of musically play our way back to the root note. Next, let's talk about our utility modules. In MIDI mode, we have a number of utilities available to us as well. The first is called beat. It's a pitchless sequencer used for defining a rhythm. It works similarly to the rest of our sequencers, but obviously, there is no pitch. This is interesting because we can use this to create a rhythm that other sequencers utilize. For example, we can progress other sequencers with this beat, or we can use this beat to modify the timing of sequencers before this module in the chain. Let's take a look. So by default, beat operates as a Euclidean rhythm sequencer. We can change the number of notes here. Okay, so this is generating pitches. But how can we use that? Well, let's put a step sequencer after it in the chain. I'm going to set this step sequencer to be a generative module. I'm not going to allow notes through. So it's going to ignore whatever notes beat outputs. But it's going to respond to them because we're going to set this sequence to advance whenever a note is received. So whenever beat outputs a note, our step sequencer is going to progress. Let's hear what that sounds like. I'll just set up a simple sequence of 4 steps. So now, rather than progressing in a regular way, our sequence is following the rhythm defined by beat. If we change the timing, our sequence is moving right along with it. Another interesting option here would be to reset the sequencer. So let's say that, let's do an interesting rhythm here. Just this kind of lurching thing. Now, I'm going to set our step sequencer to run fairly quickly, 16th notes. Now I'm going to say that we reset whenever an incoming note is received. Check this out. Now our sequence is resetting to the start whenever beat outputs a note. Let's slow this down. So that's an interesting way to just kind of add a little bit of groove or herky-jerkiness or unpredictability to your melody. Okay, so let's talk about how beat can rearrange the MIDI notes that are sent to it. Because beat is a pitchless sequencer, it doesn't transpose whatever notes come towards it, but instead it can rearrange the timing of them in a variety of ways. So, let's see how that works. I'm going to put a step sequencer in front of beat. Again, let's just define something basic. I'm going to set that to generate. And so there are 3 ways that beat can kind of change the timing of whatever you feed into it. The first is that it can mask notes. As beat runs, it only lets notes through if they land on one of its active stages. So we can see that this sequence is running, but we're not hearing every note anymore. Instead, we only hear a note if beat has an active stage there. So that could be an interesting way to just kind of like mask out certain notes. You can kind of use it as a sort of clock divider. You can say, I only want to hear every 3rd note. And we can sync this up even further by advancing the sequence when a note is received. Now it's just going to follow whatever the previous sequence is doing, but it's only letting through every 3rd note. Now, the next way that beat can affect the timing of your notes is what's called the hold mode. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to hold notes until the next active stage. If a note is received on an inactive stage, it's just going to hold on to them. And then the next time it hits an active stage, it releases all of those held notes. You can have it hold just one note, which would kind of maintain a monophonic output, or you can have it hold all of the notes and release them all at the same time and kind of generate a chord every time it hits an active stage. Let's hear that one. So in this case, it's holding all the notes that it receives from this step sequencer, and it's outputting them all at the same time. In this way, it can kind of be used as a rhythmic quantizer, since it forces whatever rhythms are coming into it to conform to the rhythm defined by beat. Notes aren't allowed until an active stage. So you're kind of defining this rhythm and you're forcing whatever is coming into beat to be conformed to that rhythm. Our other utility modules are probably familiar to you. We have a simple probability utility, which takes the output of whatever is coming into it and just gives it a probability of whether that note is kept or thrown out. So, by default, it has a 100% probability of the note being kept. Let's start to reduce that. Now we see that some notes are held back and aren't output. This can be interesting if you're using it with the beat module. Maybe you want to have a rhythm where only certain notes are output. Maybe you want to use it just like this. You like this melody, but you want to thin it out a little bit, give it a little bit of unpredictability. So just sticking a probability module in there can definitely help. The next utility that might be familiar to you is the chord. All this does is adds harmonies to whatever notes are received. So in this case, we're just going to build up a triad. We're taking the output of this sequence and we're just adding a third and a fifth. Now, everything that is output is still quantized to this scale, so it remains musical and relevant to your scale. This probably does about what you'd expect, but it does get interesting when you start thinking about combining it with some of the other modules here. For example, I think it's cool to put a probability after the chord, and then we can kind of keep some notes in that chord, but throw out others. And then we kind of get like a random voicing for each chord. It's almost like a random harmony. And for context, here was the original. For the last utility sequencer, I have to flip over to iOS for a moment. That's because this is the channel module, and not every DAW handles channels as you'd expect. But AUM for iOS does. What I've set up here is a simple sequence and put that into the channel module. I've also set up 3 different synth voices, which are all digesting Waymaker's MIDI output, but they're each listening to a different channel. You can see here, this one is taking Waymaker's output, but it has a channel filter applied so that it's only listening to channel 1. The next one is only listening to channel 2, and this one's only listening to channel 3. Now, by default, Waymaker's going to output on whatever MIDI channel you tell it to. That can be defined in the settings. However, channel module will distribute your notes to different channels. In this case, I've got it set to output to channels 1, 2, and 3. And it's going to do that in a rotating fashion. Let's just hear how that sounds. So we're taking this sequence, but we're distributing it to the 3 synthesizers in a rotating way. We can also do that in a random way. Or we can simply duplicate it. We can duplicate every note to all of the channels. Kind of like a mini orchestra. And finally, there's a shift register option as well. What that's going to do is first send each note to the first channel that you've defined. When the next note comes in, that gets sent to the first channel, and the note preceding it gets sent to the next channel. So you get this kind of chain, like a bucket brigade, where each note is going to start at the first output and then cascade down to the second output, then down to the third output. So this can kind of create like a harmony or a round robin between all of your voices. Now, let's talk about some interesting ways to build up a chain of these modules. We can use some of the stock presets available in Waymaker to do this. I'm going to start with this one, an implied chord progression. It's one of the simpler uses of Waymaker, but I also think it's one of the cooler ones. So, what we've got here is a sum in generate mode. It's running pretty fast, every 16th note. And the output of that is going to be fed into a step sequencer, running much slower, every whole note. So what that's going to do is it's going to take the output of our sum sequencer and it's going to slowly transpose it. And what that does is kind of starts to imply a chord progression, kind of like a pseudo arpeggiator type of thing. Let's just hear what it sounds like. You can see that we're moving through the second step sequence pretty slowly. And it's taking the output of sum, which isn't changing, and just transposing it. The next chain we'll take a look at is called the randomly advancing sequence. Now, the first member of this chain is just a singular beat. It's a generative beat, and it's just going to output every 8th note. Now that is going to run into a probability module, so we're only going to keep 70% of those notes. And finally, that runs into a Brownian generative module. Now, critically, this is progressing on every MIDI note. So it's going to take that original beat, which is probabilistically occurring or being thrown out, and we're using that to advance the sequence. So let's hear how that sounds. So that original beat is firing on every eighth note, but not every note is passing through this probability module. The end result is that our melody is always on an eighth note, but not every eighth note. And it kind of leads this unpredictable way where our melody progresses just in a little bit more of an interesting way. Maybe you want it to almost always happen. Maybe you want it to be really sparse. This can be nice for kind of background accents or ornaments for your song. Another interesting thing you can do here is to define a simple melody. Let's say it's just 4 steps. And this melody repeats. It's only 4 steps long. But if we put a probability in front of it, we can't really control when it repeats. This melody becomes familiar to us, but it kind of repeats in a herky-jerky, unpredictable way. So in this way, we can start to play with the relationship between rhythm and melody. Another cool thing we can do here is to have the sequence progress regularly. Let's set it to just progress on every 16th note. And then what if we reset every time we get an incoming note? Because the sequence that's being fed into our step sequencer has a probability on it, we don't really know when it's going to reset. We can make this really weird timing, like triplet quarter notes. So this is another way we can play with rhythm and melody. We can reset this sequence in a predictable or unpredictable way. The final example I want to show here uses the branching type module. I'm going to do that with this stock preset called Added Glitter. This is a Morph sequencer, which is just generating a fairly random melody, and that progresses every eighth note. And that runs into a branching module, which is just playing the original note and an octave up, but it's doing it quicker than the original sequence. This one's running at 16th notes, whereas the Morph module is running at every eighth note. So what that's going to do is it's going to inject an octave between all of the notes in that Morph sequence. But, critically, branching sequencers have a probability of firing. So the probability here is only set to 40%. So we're going to kind of get these random octaves interjected between the notes in the Morph sequence. To start, let's set it to 0%, just to hear what that sounds like. So, kind of what we'd expect. Let's start to bring in that Morph, or that branching sequence. This gets fun because we could use an even bouncier melody than this. Can make it really slow. Kind of have like an octave echo. We can also make these branching modules much more complex. So let's slow down our original morph sequence a little bit. Let's make our branching sequence a little faster. Let's add some more notes in here. So now we're randomly playing this entire melody. And you can hear that it's transposing based on the incoming note. Now, the next thing to talk about is presets. Presets are accessed from the settings menu. We've got a number of user presets and stock presets. All you need to do is just click on them to load them. But Waymaker can also serve as a preset host for Weeping Wall and Ridgewalk. So in this case, this sliding loops preset has data for Waymaker and for Weeping Wall. When that's the case, you'll see this button pop up, Load Preset and Client Data. What that's going to do is it's going to load the preset locally in Waymaker, but it's also going to have Weeping Wall load the relevant data as well. So when I loaded that, settings for both of them changed. When you're creating a preset, you can create a new preset up here. You can name it whatever you want. And when you're connected to Weeping Wall or Ridgewalk, you'll have the option to either just save the preset, which will save Waymaker's data, or you can save the preset and the client data, which is going to save whatever data Waymaker is receiving from Weeping Wall or Ridgewalk. Now, the last thing to talk about with Waymaker is parameters. If you're not sure what a parameter is, it's basically a setting that's exposed to your DAW from each plugin and lets you do things like control the plugin with automation, or in the case of Bitwig or Ableton, you can control those parameters with CV sources like LFOs or random. Now, because Waymaker is modular, it doesn't really make sense to have a set of these parameters defined. So instead, what we have in Waymaker is kind of a modulation matrix of assignable parameters. So if we go into the settings menu, we'll see the assignable parameters here. By default, nothing is assigned. And similarly, over here in Bitwig, you can see that there's a number of these parameters available. It says that they're all assignable. So let's go ahead and change that. I'm going to make this first parameter control the pitch of step 1. Now you can see over here in Bitwig, this parameter has changed its name to step 1 pitch. Now, if I change that in Bitwig, you can see this is also reflected in Waymaker. So this is pretty cool because you could do something like assign a control surface to this. If you have a MIDI controller, maybe you want to map a knob or a slider to the pitch of a stage. We've got other things available as parameter targets. You change the sequence speed overall, can change the velocity of it, change the octave of your root note. All these things are available to you to use however you want. And these are saved as part of a preset or as your save state, so they'll be reloaded. There's also presets available which will auto-assign all of these stages to the first 16 parameters. There's one of those in the stock presets list for each of the relevant sequencers. All right, that's it from me. I hope that you enjoy Waymaker, and I hope that it helps you find inspiration in your workflow. Whether you're looking to generate interesting melodies, or resample your sounds in a generative and inspirational way, or build up a complex and custom atmosphere, I hope that you can find whatever you're looking for with this or any combination of these plugins. Take care.